I read this on the recommendation of a friend and I was like, okay, it's just like a pretentious book that he likes and I'm going to read it because then he's going to think that I'm so smart. But this book immediately changed my mind. Within 10 pages, I was no longer reading for the validation of this other person. I was reading for myself. Hi, hello, how are you? I hope you're doing well because I know that I am. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're doing something very exciting. I'm going to be talking about the books that have changed my life. So these are books that I've read that I didn't just read for escapism, though that's what I usually pick up books for. These are books that surprised me, that changed the way that I see the world because little pieces of these texts kept appearing in my thoughts and recolored the way that I move through the world. And so they're favorites in a different way. They're not the books that I had the most fun reading, but they're the books that have changed who I am. The first book that I want to talk about is Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. It's a World War II novel. It follows a Lithuanian family who's removed from their home and put in various Siberian work camps. I read this when I was in middle school when I lived in Poland, so there was absolutely no shortage of World War II books for me to choose from. But what really stuck with me was that it's a unique perspective from the Lithuanian point of view, and it tells a story that is often forgotten when we think about World War II, but the way that it was told was so moving and so beautiful. The main character is an artist, as she's torn from her home and placed in these increasingly desperate living situations, she continues to draw and create art. It was the first time that I'd read something that I originally picked up for fun that made me think and feel something, and I made my best friend at the time read it, and then we had a little book club session afterwards, and I was just so excited about thinking critically. It just really ignited this excitement for literature in me where I really felt like I didn't just have to read for fun, but that I could engage with texts more critically in a way that was still really enjoyable, and there was no one grading my homework. It was just such a gratifying experience. Continuing on with the World War II historical fiction, I really fell down a hole when I was in middle school, but one that really took me by surprise was City of Thieves by David Benioff. If you recognize that name, that's because he's one of the two showrunners of the Game of Thrones show. He's the one that ruined everything for us. But way back before he messed up Game of Thrones, he was a novelist, and he published City of Thieves in 2008, and it follows basically this guy in Moscow during World War II who commits a crime, and he's offered a deal. He can either be in prison, or he has to find 12 eggs somewhere in Russia so that the princess can have a birthday cake in the middle of the war. And so he goes on this adventure to find these eggs, and obviously shenanigans and incredibly gruesome, gory war things ensue. But it was such a breath of fresh air, the kind of humanity that is injected into this story because of the ridiculous premise, but also the humor that Benioff uses to explore what it's like to be in such a desperate situation. I thought it was so wonderfully done, and for years and years and years this was my favorite book that I'd ever read, and I would buy it for all of my friends for their birthday. I really shoved it down people's throats because it was just such a transformative read and taught me a lot about how our own perceptions color the way that we experience the world, that we might not have control over what happens to us, but we have control over how we feel about it. And if we choose to bring humor into the situation, that doesn't make us bad people. It doesn't mean that we're not feeling the sorrow and pain, but it just means that we're choosing to bring humanity to a moment that otherwise lacks it. After I lived in Poland, I moved to France. I lived in Paris for 3 years, and once I arrived, I was very quickly made aware that there is a book written about my old high school. And it's not like a history, oh, this is the foundation of this preppy, international school. No, an ex-teacher who did something unthinkable, left the school because he was fired for the incredibly disgusting things that he did, and then wrote a book about it. He wrote a book about how he exploited minors and then had the nerve to publish it as literary fiction. This book was then blurbed by the New York Times. This book about a teacher who had a malicious and disgusting relationship with a minor, impregnated her, and made her get an abortion. He wrote a book and got it published without her consent. It was horrifying to read. Because at first I went in and I was like, oh yeah, whatever, it's like totally fine. Like, nah, it's a book about a teacher that used to go here. And then suddenly I started recognizing teachers that were teaching me. And the description of the school, the description of the poplar trees outside, the walk to the cafeteria. It was all visceral and real. And he was telling this story like it was okay. Like what he did was fine. It was horrifying to read this book from the perspective of a grown adult justifying what he had done. And it completely redefined my relationship with literature. Because suddenly it definitely was not only escapism or a means for me to achieve my own self-actualization by educating myself, but I saw authorial intent for the first time. You know, you see this in Gossip Girl in season 2 when Dan is writing the expose about the Bass family and everyone's like, dude, don't do it. And he's like, well, it's just writing. And you're like, no one would do that in real life. This guy did. This guy did at the expense of a 17-year-old girl. So yeah, that one definitely changed my life. Moving on, moving past that is Othello, which is the first book that is on this list that I read for school properly. So this was my senior year of high school. We were asked to read it the summer before we came back, and I read it and I was like, yeah, this is meh. We started reading it as a class, going line by line and really meticulously pulling this play apart. And the characters made me reconsider the world in a way that I'd never had to do before. When you're watching a Disney movie, it's very clear like who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. And even if you decide to root for the bad guy, it's like, oh, well, yeah, like obviously they think that they're doing the right thing, but they're wrong. Like, because there still is an objective right thing to do and they're not doing it. They're misguided, which is why they are evil. It's not that they're doing evil things, it's that they themselves are embodiments of this idea of evil. And reading Othello was the first time that I'd ever really had to question that. It makes me feel dumb to say it out loud now, because I'm like, how did you not realize this before? I don't know, I guess I was a really sheltered 17-year-old. But reading Othello was the first time that in my mind that distinction really clicked, that there is no such thing as an evil person. There are only people who do good things and who do bad things. I don't know. This was the book that really solidified for me that there aren't really heroes and villains, that there are just people who make choices that have consequences. And yeah, I guess it really is a testament to how sheltered my life was that it took me 17 years to figure that out. But that's what it was. Once I got to college, I found it really hard to actually get myself to read a lot. It was kind of a struggle to pick up books consistently that I wasn't reading for school, and my habit of reading for pleasure slowly petered out until I wasn't really reading at all. The summer after my freshman year, I was on vacation with my family, and I realized I didn't really have anything to do. I didn't want to be on my phone all the time, and so I was like, oh, I guess I'll go to a Barnes & Noble, and I picked up a whole bunch of classics. And the one that I read first, Slaughterhouse-Five, completely recolored my perception of the classic. Slaughterhouse-Five follows this young man, Billy Pilgrim, in World War II as he moves through Germany. He ends up in Dresden for the tragic fire bombings. And the story is told in a disjointed way where sometimes you're with his perspective before the war, during the war, or after, and after the war, he's kind of delusional and thinks he has been abducted by aliens called Trifomdorians. He thinks he like lives with these little green guys. So there's like this absurdism and this horrible tragedy, and the narration is so tongue-in-cheek and so fun. It's so interesting and engrossing and gripping, but also heart-wrenching and nightmarish, these descriptions of war. But this way that PTSD is portrayed gave me such a different insight into how someone else could potentially see the world that like completely reinvigorated my love for reading. I was like, this is why I read. I don't just read because I want to read about other people who are like myself. I want to see how other people see the world. And that burst that whole thing wide open for me and made me so excited to get back into reading. So like, could not recommend Slaughterhouse-Five more as a classic to get you out of a reading slump, or a classic to get you into the classics. All right, so I was editing this video and like getting ready to just like post it and whatever, and I realized that I forgot one of like the most influential books I've ever read in my entire life, and I like had a total meltdown and I almost started crying because I was so upset that I forgot this book, which is A Clergyman's Daughter by George Orwell. Basically, in Paris, there's a very famous bookstore, Shakespeare and Company, and sometimes they'll do blind date with a book deals where for €5 you get a beautiful cardboard box with a mystery book inside, and there's no description, absolutely nothing. You just pick up the box and like that's it. I did this with a good friend of mine, and I saw this like old wrinkled copy of a George Orwell book I didn't know and was not enthused about it. And then this same summer after my freshman year, much later, when I'd already gotten back into reading, I decided, you know, what the hell, like it's one of the only physical books that I have at my parents' house, like I guess I might as well read it, and I absolutely fell in love. The kinds of ideas that George Orwell is exploring in his speculative fiction, you see come to life in his examination of the English middle class, and you follow this girl who lives a very regimented life in the countryside, and one day she loses her memory and winds up in London and has no idea who she is, where she's going, where she's been, or how to make money, and has to figure out how to get home and how to survive in London with nothing. It's just such a wonderful examination about the choices that we make and the people that we choose to become. It's such a heart-wrenching story. It absolutely broke me. So this is a book that I think like literally everyone's sleeping on, because everyone and their mom loves to say that 1984 is their favorite book. And like, you like George Orwell? Read this, because this gives an entire new level of dimension to the kinds of things that he was writing about. It gives so much context. Then the first book that I read at college that I like absolutely loved was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. It completely blew me away. The mastery with which this book is written is absolutely astonishing. I felt like at that point that was the first time that I'd read a classic with adequate knowledge of the literary history upon which it is built to get more out of it than just the plot. That was really exciting for me, to feel like I was not only reading this isolated piece of literature, but also reading an installment in the history of Russian literature up until that point. And feeling involved with that process was really exciting and really intellectually rewarding. And even on its own, the plot and the kinds of analysis that Dostoevsky is making is just so incredible. So yeah, that kind of like made me feel like, oh, it really is worth it to learn about all of this like philosophy and to read Pushkin and Lermontov. Like, it makes sense because it's building towards something more. It's because in my engineering degree, when I learn something in a material science class and then I go into a lab class, I know that the skills that I've gained in this class are directly applicable. Whereas in an English class, it always felt much more abstract. And this was the first time that I was really able to like make that transition in what felt like a really effective way. Then, of course, this list wouldn't be complete without some sad girl vibes from Sally Rooney. When I read Normal People, it came into my life at really the perfect time. I was dealing with really similar questions about how my identity from when I was in high school and my identity from university were at odds with each other, and how to move forward and how to reconcile these feelings that I had towards people who had treated me a certain way in high school. As everybody and their mom will tell you, Normal People is just one of those books that stays with you. I went into Normal People thinking I was going to get a love story. I came out of it feeling like I'd spent 3 days reflecting on myself and my priorities as though I had read a self-help book. Sally Rooney's powers of transporting you into her world and making you empathize are absolutely unparalleled in this market, at least as to what I've seen. And so she did it to me. And then is Stoner. I read this on the recommendation of a friend, and I was like, okay, it's just like a pretentious book that he likes, and I'm going to read it because then he's going to think that I'm so smart. But this book immediately changed my mind. Within 10 pages, I was no longer reading for the validation of this other person. I was reading for myself. This was another book that just came into my life at the perfect time and had me reevaluate the kinds of decisions I was making and forced me to rethink how much control I have over my life. This grandiose idea of the future that we've constructed for ourselves. This idea that I'll work hard now so that I can have X, Y, and Z in the future because I want to be at this position, I want to have this job, I want to have this title, I want to have this many kids at this time. How all of those plans, in the end, mean nothing because the future doesn't exist. Because the moment that you get there, you're in the present. And there's always more future. And if you're only ever planning for those kinds of things, then you watch your life slip away from you. You watch the things that you wanted pass you by as they no longer hold the excitement and value that you'd placed on them when you were younger. And reading that really forced me to take control over my own life, to take control over my present, and to make the days that I was living in as fulfilling as I could in that moment, because if I didn't do something about it now, I knew that it would never happen. And this book really scared me, and it shaped the way that I live my life. It's shaped the way that I live every day, the way that I make my decisions, and the way that I think about how I want my life to turn out. All right, just before we close this out, I want to do a rapid fire of other classics that I really liked, that I think are good entryways into the classics, or just absolute standouts that just didn't have the same kind of lasting impact on me, but I still think are absolutely excellent. So we have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, Passing by Nella Larson, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, and All of the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. With that, we have reached the end of this list of classics and literary fiction that has changed my life. I hope there's something on this list that spoke to you. Any of these books, except You Deserve Nothing, I think are worth a read. As always, I've had an absolutely wonderful time hanging out with you. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed yourself, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.